So what rights do you actually have when it comes to eminent domain?
Just by saying no, a landowner cannot stop a project.
Today we're joined by Tiffany Dowell Lashmet, agriculture law specialist with Texas A&M University, as we break down what eminent domain really means for landowners and where perception doesn't always match reality.
This is probably the number one misconception about eminent domain.
From who can actually take your land to what's just compensation really mean and what you should and shouldn't do should the issue of eminent domain ever land on your doorstep. Then we'll switch directions and talk about hornflies. Do we really know how much hornflies are costing our operations and why timing your control matters more than you think? That's on this episode of the Working Ranch Radio Show. Private property rights has always been a big topic in the ranching industry. No different here today as we talk about eminent domain. As you heard there in the opening, we're going to get into that in just a few moments. Hi, everyone. Justin Mills, your host of the Working Ranch Radio Show. Good to have you with us on our program today. Hey, if you missed something, you want to go back and listen to it again, you can find all of our shows by going to our site at workingranchradio.com, or you can find us on any major podcast platform or minor one as well. Find us there, search Working Ranch Radio Show. There we are. And also leave us a ratings or a review. That is very helpful, not only to us, but to other folks as well. Also, coming up later in the show, we're going to be talking about a product that actually came into the market back in 1975, but boy, did it revolutionize fly control in our industry as a feed-through product. So we'll be talking about that. Then later in the show, meteorologist Don Day steps in as we talk and look at our long-range weather forecast and some good news possibly in sight for some folks that have been in some dry areas. We're going to talk about what he thinks later on in the show. Hey, the latest issue, it is the April-May issue of Working Ranch Magazine, has been out now. And if you don't have a copy, you can get your subscription started by going to workingranchmag.com, or it's as simple as stopping by your local Tractor Supply store. And a shout out here today to the Tractor Supply store in Alamogordo, New Mexico, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in Alexandria, Louisiana, and in Alpine, Texas. Well, our subject here today is on eminent domain, and joining us on the program is Tiffany Dowell Lashmet. She's an agriculture law specialist with Texas A&M University. And Tiffany, good to have you here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Yeah, Justin, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm glad to be here.
Well, as we get into having the conversation about eminent domain, I think it's definitely, as you and I were talking before we started here today, it is one of those things that a lot of us are kind of have a vague understanding or feel like we maybe have more of an understanding about, but probably there's some misconceptions. I want to address that later on in the show. But I think to start here today, let's just get a basic understanding of eminent domain and where does that authority actually come from here in the United States?
Sure, absolutely. I think you're right. I think eminent domain is probably, if we hear those terms, I think everybody has a general idea probably of what it means. I will say you'll sometimes also hear that called condemnation. Same thing, right? So condemnation, eminent domain is the same thing. And essentially what it is, it's the right of the government or an entity with government authority to take private property for public use upon the payment of just compensation.
Okay.
So those are big fancy words, right? But essentially what it means is the government can come in sometimes under certain circumstances and actually condemn your private property, and they have to pay you to do that. So the classic example would be if they're going to put in a state highway, right? They would use eminent domain to do that. They would come and take an easement from the landowner, right? And they would pay you for taking that easement. That's kind of the basic eminent domain example. Lots of other examples of things that can be taken by eminent domain, right? I'd say roads are common, pipelines, transmission lines, schools, hospitals, that type of thing we sometimes see. The authority from that comes primarily from the United States Constitution, the Fifth Amendment. It's actually written in negative, which is interesting. It says, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. We can talk about compensation in a minute if you want. Certainly most, if not all, state constitutions have similar provisions as well.
Mm-hmm. And I know today we're not going to be able to get into the details of some of the state things because this is a broad show that goes across the country. But I think, one of the things that I was reading in when we start looking about this is that the Fifth Amendment of the United States provides kind of the floor about what eminent domain is, whereas the states that are going to be different from state to state kind of have to set the ceiling of where eminent domain goes, how far that goes. Is that kind of your understanding on it too?
Yeah, I think that's right. Because the Fifth Amendment really doesn't give us any details. It literally just says that short sentence I read to you, right? So all of the details, what does the process look like? What do they have to do before they can take your property? How do you calculate just compensation? What is considered public use and not? So much of that is decided at the state level, either through statutes or regulations or state case law. That's really where all of your details come. And like you say, on a show like yours, where it makes it difficult to get way in the weeds because it just differs state to state.
Yeah. You had talked about and given some definitions of what public use what could fall under that umbrella of public use and what that means today. Over the years, do you feel that definition has changed over time, maybe than what the framers originally had in mind?
Yeah, well, admittedly, I'm no constitutional historian, right? So it's hard to know what they had in mind, but the world's a lot different than it was then. I'll give you an example of a case from Texas where that exact argument was at issue. There was a plan here in Texas to build like a bullet train, right? Like high-speed rail from Houston to Dallas. And one of the statutes that company was relying on for eminent domain talked about inner something railways. And the whole argument over eminent domain power for this high-speed rail under that was, wait a minute, when that statute was passed in the 20s, this was talking about like a trolley car that went from one end of town to the other. The statute, when they wrote it, they never thought about, a high-speed rail that was going to go from Dallas to Houston and travel 500 miles an hour. Like, that's not what the thought was. And that's where some of this can get a little bit interesting is, how is a court going to interpret that language, right? Is it the more narrow, more specific, like what was in place at the time when the statute was passed? Or is it the broader railway idea? The Texas Supreme Court, and again, this is Texas specific, but the Texas Supreme Court went with the broader interpretation and said that eminent domain could be used for that high-speed rail. So that's the perfect answer, right? Of, you had a simple statute that said you could have these railways. Well, technology in the world changed, and now it becomes a much different question.
Yeah. Since we're on the sort of the subject here, a little bit talking about case law, is there anything that's from the U.S. Supreme Court side of things that has tackled this eminent domain issue?
Sure, there are. There's been a number of eminent domain cases at the United States Supreme Court. And this is where, again, from a nerdy legal perspective, it can get sort of interesting. I'll give you one example. There's a case that was decided, I'm going to guess the early 2000s. It was shortly before I went to law school at the U.S. Supreme Court called Kelo. And in that case, I think it was back east, maybe in Maryland. And this woman had a little house that she had lived in forever. She was in her 80s or something. And they came in and they were going to condemn the house to build like a big complex. I think it was for Dow Chemical, right? So like this big, like office buildings and things like that. And their public use for that was, it was going to be for economic development and like a tax base. And the Supreme Court said that could be a public use. A lot of states, though, pushed back against that. And under their state constitution said economic development or increasing the tax base is not a public use under the state law. So there's an example. What else? There was a case a couple years ago at the Supreme Court on eminent domain that involved some flooding here in Texas, and whether or not the state could be responsible for flooding. That one kind of got decided on a technicality, so not super instructive, but they looked at it there. Historic eminent domain cases, like all the big rules about how we decide whether or not something is a taking, came out of the U.S. Supreme Court.
Yeah. So then that brings up this question, especially in light of the one you were talking about with, I think it was Kelo versus the city of New London was the one you referenced first there. Okay. So my question is this, because this was something I kind of maybe if I stopped and thought about it, I'd say, okay, I see where this works. But the mindset was, it's not just for governments. Can private companies also do this?
that this is probably the number one misconception about eminent domain is we all, and I say this all the time, we may not like that the government wants to come in and take private property for a road, but I think we all understand, right, that it has to happen. We may be mad, but it has to happen. Where people get real frustrated is when it's not the government, but it's a private entity who has been given that authority by the government. Mm-hmm. Again, I could speak to Texas law. In Texas, common carrier pipelines have the right of eminent domain. And what that is that's a private for-profit pipeline company that's going to build a pipeline and then is going to let other companies run their gas through the line. That's how you become a quote unquote common carrier. And in Texas, by statute, the legislature has given them eminent domain authority. And people get very frustrated with the idea that this private for-profit company has the right to come in and take their private property under eminent domain. Yeah. And again, that may not be the same in every state. Certainly in Texas, that is an issue. And like I say, it's one that a lot of folks don't realize until they land in that situation.
Well, and I think, Tiffany, in some of that concept or vein of thinking and the frustration that we see with private entities that can do this would be whoever has the most money or the highest paid attorneys win.
Sure. I think that's definitely a complaint that I hear a lot. Definitely one that resonates with me, right? A lot of these companies have lawyers, in-house counsel and on retainer, and you're a private landowner having to go out and try to foot the bill to fight this. I'll tell you, and this is another place where the law differs by state. In only about half the states does a landowner who successfully challenges eminent domain have the ability to recover their attorney fees. So what that means here in Texas, let's say that they come in and they're going to take your land and they give you a super low ball offer.
Yeah.
You fight it, you win, right? Maybe you got 100 times the amount they offered you. You're not going to get your attorney fees back because we don't have an attorney fee provision here in Texas. So I ask people all the time, is the landowner made whole in that scenario? And the answer is no, right? Because maybe they got the value of their property that they deserved, but they're still out what's likely going to be tens, if not hundreds of $1,000s in attorney's fees. And so that's a real problem in some states, Texas included, where you don't have that. So that just factors into what you're saying about how it could really become a problematic thing from an attorney fee perspective.
Yeah. Okay, so we've kind of talked the basics here. Let's take a break here, Tiffany. When we come back, I want to talk about some more. You've touched on a couple misconceptions. I want to continue down that road of talking about those gaps between what's the perception and reality. When we start talking about eminent domain, we'll do that when we come back, okay?
Sounds great.
Imagine keeping your cattle exactly where you want them, while being able to tap into insights powered by a collar and an app. No Fence is the world's first virtual fencing system for grazing livestock. From the palm of your hand and delivered with GPS technology, you can set and move pasture boundaries, gain insight into grazing patterns, receive reduced animal activity alerts, and more. No wires, no posts, just empowered grazing that supports healthier land and your herd goals. 10,000 plus producers globally already trust No Fence. Explore the possibilities at nofence.com.
Horn flies stressing your cattle? Make fly control one and done with Alticid IGR XRB. Alticid IGR XRB delivers season-long horn fly control from a single application bolus, providing up to 195 days of relief regardless of mineral consumption or location. It breaks the horn fly life cycle with no impact on beneficial insects, giving you flexible, consistent control. Learn more at cargillanimalnutrition.com/Alticid bolus.
Okay, Tiffany, let's walk through some of the biggest misconceptions that landowners may have about eminent domain. And we'll start with this. Can a landowner actually stop a project just by saying no?
So great question. Just by saying no, a landowner cannot stop a project, right? And that's, I know that that's really frustrating to think that I'm a landowner and I have these private property rights and I ought to be able to say, no, you can't put that here. Eminent domain allows that to happen, right? It allows for your property to be taken for a public use so long as they pay you just compensation. So it's not as simple as, no, I don't want them to come here. Now, there may be processes in place, right? Depending on the type of project and the state law.
Yeah.
There may be opportunities to object. There may be opportunities to intervene. There may be opportunities to put your input in on where, let's say the transmission line, where the transmission line should be placed. There's lots of opportunities for input, but you don't have the ability to just say, no, we don't want you here. You have to leave. If they have eminent domain authority, that won't work.
Yeah. You had talked about in the previous segment, and you just mentioned it there, about just compensation. So when we hear about just compensation, how is that? What is considered just compensation? Because that's probably another sticky widget in all of this.
That's a great question. And again, one where I think landowners can find themselves pretty frustrated. So when we're looking at just compensation, and again, the details on this can differ by state. You're going to be so sick of me saying that, but it's true. So essentially what you're looking for is the fair market value of the land. And so a lot of times what you'll see is they'll look at kind of a before and after test. So what is the value of the land before the easement, right? So the market value of the land today versus the market value of the land with the easement put there, whatever that might be, and the landowner would get the difference. Now, there are some other things to consider when we talk just compensation. One of those, at least in Texas, we recognize this, it's something called remainder damages. What I mean by that is a lot of times the appraisers will come to pretty similar numbers on, what is owed for this 60-foot easement that they're going to take, right? A lot of times that's not that different. Where, depending on the facts, where you could see vastly different numbers from a plaintiff's appraiser and the government appraiser is for the remainder damages. And that is, what effect does that easement have, not on the value of the strip of easement, but on the rest of the property, right? So I'll give you an example. Let's say we have a case where there's a piece of property with highway frontage on a main roadway, and the easement's going to come in and it's going to block that highway frontage. And now you can't develop there and you can't build a driveway across it. Well, yeah, the value of that easement strip is probably not that much, right? We just figure out the number of square feet or acres, however you're going to figure it and pay for it. But what does that easement do to the value of the remainder of that property? There are some cases and some fact scenarios where that can be really significant. So remainder damages is something that comes into play. Another thing you have to think about when we're talking about compensation is it's called the highest and best use of the property. And so let's say we've got an example of kind of on the edge of a city, and maybe we've got a 4-way intersection, and 3 of those 4 sides of the intersection are developed, right? We got a car dealership and a McDonald's and a gas station. But that 4th corner is ranch lands. And they want to come in and value the ranch land. The landowner there would argue, and likely successfully, right, that the highest and best use of that property is not ranch land, it's commercial development.
Sure.
Right? And so you have to sort of figure in that highest and best use as well. One thing that's not considered, and I think, again, this is the place where there can be a misconception, it can be really frustrating, is like any sort of sentimental value of the land. And so think about if you're a multi-generation rancher and you've had this land forever, and now we're going to have something like a highway or a transmission line or the high-speed rail, like we talked about, coming through it. It's not just the value of the dirt, right? It is that, but there's just more to it than that for those ranch families. And that is not something that gets taken into account when we're dealing with eminent domain.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk another misconception. You kind of brought this up when we were talking before we started here today, and it references back to a very popular television program that has spun off into some different ones, but initially started, and that was Yellowstone, and how they tried to save their ranch from eminent domain through conservation easement. Explain that misconception.
Yeah, so this was super popular. I can't tell you the number of phone calls I got. And they tried lots of different things in Yellowstone, right? In fact, we did 2 podcast episodes on my podcast talking about legal lessons from Yellowstone. So there was lots to talk about there. 2 big things they tried, like you said, is they were going to put the land in a conservation easement. And that would just stop any sort of eminent domain activity. The other was there was a big scheme with the Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP, right? We'll sign up for CRP and that'll stop them from building the ski resort. Again, laws differ by state, so I'm not going to swear to you that you couldn't come up with something. But in general, schemes like that just don't work, right? There's not a blanket. If you have a conservation easement, there's no way they can take it for eminent domain, or there's no way they can put a pipeline. It just doesn't work that way most of the time. And so I tell people a lot, right? If you think you've come up with some sort of gotcha, my guess is there's been a lot of lawyers and a lot of folks spend a lot of time on this, that they didn't choose that for a reason, right?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the reality understanding of that, because I think I'm sure it did cause a lot of people to think, oh, here we go. This is what we can do. And
yes,
of course,
right. Yeah.
Going down that road isn't quite as simple as like they made it sound out in the show. Is like, one show we talked about it, the next show we had it in place.
That's right. Well, and then there's so many other implications, right? Like you sign up for a conservation easement, and I'm not against them by any means. It could be a great tool if you've really thought through what you're doing and the implications of that. Like you said, it's not like a 30-minute break and bam, everything's done and easy and ready. And, they never talk to an accountant on that show. They never go see a lawyer. They just do it.
Yeah. When they don't show those bills either.
That's exactly right. Right.
Is there any other misconceptions we haven't hit yet?
I guess the one other thing I might say, and this kind of flows along with some of the other stuff we talked about, but a lot of times the landowner has very little say on where the easement might be. Again, you can always ask, could it be routed this way? Depending on the process in your state, there might be an opportunity to be involved in like a routing process. We have that here in Texas. But in general, I will tell you that it's the company that gets to kind of come up with the map and the route. And I think that surprises landowners sometimes as well.
Yeah. A question here would be, what do you think are some of the biggest mistakes people make early on in the process when that letter shows up in the mail or somebody's knocking on the door?
Yeah. So I think I'm going to tell you two things, and they're really two kind of completely opposite mistakes, but both mistakes. I think the first mistake is the folks that just ignore it, right? Okay. If I ignore this, if I don't read this, if I throw it in the trash, it's going to go away. It's not going away, right? So I think big mistake to just ignore it and do nothing. I think on the flip side, also big mistake to just immediately sign the first thing that they put in front of you, right? Because look, think about it from just like a common sense perspective. If you're the government or the company or whatever it is who's got this eminent domain power, you're not going to give your best offer, be it monetary or be it, terms you're going to negotiate. You don't give your best offer at the beginning, right? It's like buying a car or a horse or whatever. You don't make the best offer at the beginning. There's got to be some negotiation there. And sometimes I see this where people will just be so scared of the fact that, it's eminent domain and they could sue me, that they just immediately sign the first offer. And that's a mistake as well. Yeah.
Well, let's take another break here because we're headed down a road that I wanted to go, and that is okay. So we've spelled out what it is. We spelled out some of the misconceptions. And now let's get into what do we have as resources as landowners to deal with this, and how do we go forward? You've kind of started that conversation. I want to do that when we come back and continue. Okay?
Sounds great.
Leverage the cattle fly and insect control solution that refuses to be average. ProZap Protectus Pour-On Insecticide IGR. Now, this isn't your average pour-on. It's a triple active solution you can count on. An insect growth regulator, adulticide, and synergist, all working together to knock down profit-robbing insects that affect cattle health and your bottom line. Ready to use as a pour-on for season-long control of lice, which means less time in the chute and more time getting things done. For fewer treatments and less handling that pays in dividends, choose Protectus. Talk to your Neogen rep or order through your distributor today. Visit prozap.com for more information. All right, my guest today is Tiffany Dowell Lashmet. She is a law specialist with Texas A&M University as we are talking on eminent domain. And Tiffany, as we get into this last part, I think it's important now we kind of leave here with, okay, what do we do as ranchers? We've started that conversation a little bit. So when that letter shows up in the mail or somebody's knocking on the door, you've started to outline that a little bit. And so even though we can't really get state by state with what we're talking about here today, because there will be variations from state to state, I think we can still outline some very basic principles that we as landowners could be doing, as you addressed there in the first thing. So at what point then do you move into getting professional or legal help?
Great question. So I'm going to steal a line here from an eminent domain lawyer and friend of mine here in Texas named Jim Bradbury. And Jim always tells people, you've got to get over being mad and get smart. Mm-hmm. So he will tell them, take your day to be mad, and then you got to get smart, right? And I think it's that quick that it's probably a good idea to get a lawyer involved, just because it's not that folks aren't intelligent enough to understand this. It's not that you're not smart enough to negotiate. This is just a really different game. There are strange procedures. There are rules that the layperson wouldn't be aware of, right, in the process. Mm-hmm. And so I recommend kind of upfront, I think it's smart to get a lawyer engaged, especially somebody who does eminent domain work in your state. That's what I'd be looking for, right? Lawyer in your state who has handled eminent domain cases for landowners. And I think getting them involved up front is a smart play. Yeah.
The next question kind of goes into the negotiation process in this, and it's going to vary by state. Like we said, as you had mentioned earlier, people are probably going to get tired of us saying that, but I think we're being very clear in that. And in what I have seen in some cases where companies have moved doing projects that could probably fall under the headline or bearing of eminent domain, but there has been first negotiations in all of that. Do you feel, or what have you seen out there? Do companies like to negotiate first before they would get to that point of eminent domain, or what have you found, or is it really no variation there?
Good question. Companies absolutely would rather negotiate an easement than have to deal with eminent domain. Zero question to that.
Okay.
For a couple of reasons, right? Number one, just from like a public perception PR perspective, they don't want to be the company that's going out and suing landowners to take their land, right? That just doesn't look good. Number two, from a cost perspective, right? I mean, it's much easier to negotiate a settlement, get that on paper, even if they're paying you a little bit extra. That's cheaper for them than to have to go through the legal lawsuit process of eminent domain. The third thing I would say, again, at least in Texas, is they actually have to negotiate with you before they can go through the eminent domain process. We have rules where they have to give you an initial offer and then wait so many days, and they got to give you a final offer and then wait so many days. So it's actually part of the requirement to be able to exercise, the eminent domain power is that you have to negotiate. So they absolutely want to. And as a landowner, you should absolutely want to. Like I said, sometimes companies will come in hot and they're going to say, well, if you don't agree to, our form here, we're going to sue you and take this land. And I always tell landowners, don't let that scare you. And I realize that's easier said than done, right? Well, a lot of folks have never been sued before. They've never gone to court. And it feels like, well, I must have done something wrong to get sued. That's not true at all. The lawsuit is just part of the eminent domain process, right? I mean, it's literally just part of how this goes. And so I always really encourage people, don't panic over the idea that there could be a lawsuit filed, right? That's part of the procedure. Heck, sometimes the negotiations don't get good until that lawsuit gets filed. So I would just, encourage people, don't let that scare you into signing the first thing they offer.
Okay. You talked a little bit about that negotiation. Some states would require that. Maybe some states we're not quite sure if they do or not. But from an overall broad standpoint, what can be negotiated in most cases, regardless of the state you live in?
Yeah, great question. And one that's really important. Obviously, the first thing that everybody thinks about is the dollar amount, right? You can certainly negotiate the value, that fair market value that you're owed for that land. You see lots of back and forth on that. I think that's something most companies at least expect. That's probably the one that gets negotiated the most often. What I would tell you is this: don't overlook the importance of negotiating other terms beyond just the money. Especially if you're a landowner, you got a working ranch situation where you're going to still be on that land all around wherever this easement is. Having good terms there to protect your land might be as important or more so than that dollar amount. So some things that, just to think about. You want to make sure that they're getting a single easement for a single whatever it is, right? So if they're going to get a pipeline easement, that's for one pipeline, not for pipelines, plural. How wide is the easement going to be? If it's a pipeline that's going to be dug, you may want to ask for the double ditch method, which is a way to dig that trench where you can make sure the topsoil gets put back on top when they remediate it. Terms about how you want it remediated, right? Reseeding grass, things like that. What else? If they're going to build fences, you may want to try to negotiate good fence building in there, right? You could have requirements about how many strands and tensile strength and, steel H braces, stuff like that. So lots to think about. And we've got on our website, we've got some information on this. Some states, Texas has this now, may have certain minimal requirements to have to be included in certain easements. That's a good place to look to start, right? Just lots of little things like that can be really important to the landowner that you might not think about in the negotiation process.
Yeah. Talked a little bit about some pipeline examples in there. What have you seen? Because I know in Texas, you have this as well, but what are you seeing? Is there anything that has been more specific to wind and solar?
So not necessarily. For wind and solar, the projects themselves, they don't take land by eminent domain, right? They do voluntary leases to build the projects. Now, that said, they have to have transmission capacity to get that energy generated somewhere else. And so we certainly have seen a massive build out, and it's ramping up again, of additional transmission lines across the state to transport more power in general. Certainly some of that is wind and solar power. So like I say, not really for the wind and solar project itself, but certainly for the transmission of power that they would fall into. Yeah,
very good. Okay, so as we've talked about here today, if you could give one piece of advice to landowners, no matter where they're at across the country, what would that be?
So I'm going to cheat and I'm going to give two.
That's fine. Yeah.
The first one is, like I said, I think important upfront, don't ignore it. Get legal help that's licensed in your jurisdiction who has done this, right? It is a terrible thing to have to face. I understand that. I know that it's very frustrating, but not ignoring it, getting legal help, I think is really important. That's number one. Number two, we didn't say this, but I think I want to make sure we say, make sure that when you're negotiating any sort of easement and any sort of contract, really, don't rely on any verbal promises. Sometimes you'll see those landmen will come out and they promise you everything from here to kingdom come. Yeah. None of it's written down. And then when it comes time to enforce what was promised, you can't because it wasn't in the written document. So make sure anything that you get agreed to is in that written document.
And those meetings that you have with various people, recorded?
Probably a good idea. Yeah, probably a good idea to record. But I'll tell you, even if you have recorded promises, if they're not included in that document, probably still not going to be enforceable.
Sure.
Based on the language of the written document. So not a bad idea to record, not a bad idea to have another witness in the room, things like that. But making sure everything's in that written document, really critical.
Yeah. All right. Well, Tiffany, very good information there. A lot of good takeaways. I think some very good advice in that. Before you head out, a couple things that I did want you to address. I know you have a podcast. I'll have you talk about that here in a little bit. But real quick, something I've been asking our guests, what's the book on the top of your reading list right now?
I love this question. I'm for sure a reader, so I'm going to give you two again. This is going to be old school, but I recently listened to the audio version of To Kill a Mockingbird.
Oh, yeah.
Did that on the way to and from the Houston Livestock Show. It's narrated by Sissy Spacek. It's fabulous. I've read it a couple of times. I read it in high school, read it in law school, but the audio version was great. The second book I'm going to mention, I read last year and loved it. It's by an author named Mary Louise Kelly, and it's called It Goes So Fast. It's kind of a working mom perspective on raising kids and trying to, do everything at once. And it was really useful for me to read as I'm, trying to be a lawyer and chase kids around and show animals and cattle and everything else. So
That sounds very, very busy. All right. So I know you have a podcast. You mentioned it a bit ago, and you addressed some of the stuff that we talked about here today, as well as many other things. So what's the link? How do we get to your podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. It's called Ag Law in the Field, and we're on all of the podcast apps. So just look for Ag Law in the Field, or you can Google us. We've done about 210 episodes on different ag law topics, had some of the best lawyers from around the country on the show. As you can imagine, we've covered the gamut of topics, including lots on eminent domain. So feel free to check that out. Lots of good information there.
And then your website, you'd mentioned something. There was some information that people could go to if they wanted some information. What was that website?
Yeah, that's right. It's called the Texas Agriculture Law Blog. You can Google that. The website is just agrilife.org/Texas Ag Law.
Okay. All right. Very good. Well, a good conversation here today. I appreciate the insight. And man, you have a lot of information there that I think for folks that as this may or may not happen at some point in time, at least here's a resource that if it does, that letter shows up in your mailbox or you get the knock on the door or the phone call, maybe they can reference this show and use it as a point of at least getting an idea of the basics of where they get started. And then, as we both referenced in many cases, there's going to be some state law that also plays into all of this. So Tiffany, thank you for joining us here today and good information that you shared with us.
Yeah, thank you, Justin. I appreciate it.
You bet. And again, that was Tiffany Dowell Lashmet. She is a law specialist with Texas A&M University here on our discussion here today. Just real quick, if you want to follow along on her podcast, as she had mentioned, it is called Ag Law in the Field. You can find it on all major platforms. And then that blog site, if you just search under Texas Agriculture Law, you will find that blog. Well, stay with us. Coming up next, we're talking fly control, and it's really on a product that's been in the market since 1975 as a feed-through. It's revolutionized our cattle industry when it comes to fly control. We'll be talking about that next.
Capitalize on crossbreeding with Gelbvieh and Balancer bulls. Raise replacement females with added fertility, increased longevity, and greater productivity. Gelbvieh and Balancer influence females wean more pounds of calf per cow exposed. In the feed yard, Balancer influenced cattle offer increased performance, improved feed efficiency, and have excellent carcass merit. Balancers add the pounds, make the grade, and deliver the value. This year, make your crossbreeding count with Gelbvieh and Balancer genetics.
You know, your pasture is under attack. Yeah, horn flies. They're wreaking havoc on your herd, dealing damage to your cattle's weight, and in turn, that does affect your bottom line. That's why you need a solution in your arsenal that can withstand an attack. Alticid IGR is the first and proven feed-through that is battle-tested as an effective hornfly management product, delivering the defense needed to keep your herd productive and your profit strong. Win the battle for your cattle. Learn more at alticidIGR.com. And joining us now here on the Working Ranch Radio Show is Brian Hupp, who is the National Account Manager, Feed Additives at Central Life Sciences. And Brian, good to have you here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Listen, I really appreciate you having me on.
Well, we get to this time of the year, and I know for some, they've finished up calving, maybe some are in the middle of it, but nevertheless, we're starting to look ahead at these spring and summer months and what that has in store for us. And a lot of times in a lot of different parts, well, in about every part of the country, fly control is one of the things that always comes up. And when we get into that, it's the horn fly is something that does have a pretty significant economic impact to our entire beef industry.
It's amazing, Justin. The fly season always seems to kind of creep up on us, or certain areas of the country. It seems like we don't even have spring. We go from winter to summer overnight. And yes, that fly season creeps up on us. And more specifically, that horn fly that you were talking about, if somebody has pastured cattle, their cow-calf operation, or even running stockers, and they're on a true pasture situation, that horn fly is by far the most costly external parasite to them as a producer and to their cattle. We can talk about face flies. We can talk about stable, house, deer, horse, you name it. Whatever fly you want to talk about, they all have an impact and negatively impact cattle, but none of them are more costly than that horn fly, being the most costly external parasite in North America, costing the industry over $2 billion per year. And so it's something that people need to pay attention to. And it's obviously something that I think is easy to plan for because Justin, I have yet to find, I travel all over this country. I've yet to find anybody that tells me they haven't had a fly season. The flies come every year, and they have since the beginning of time. And so it's something you can plan on and count on. It's kind of like you live in Wyoming and I live in Missouri. I know when winter comes, I need a hat and a coat and some gloves. And I plan for that because it happens every single year, and fly season happens every year, and it's easy for people to plan for.
Mm-hmm. When we talk about that impact on our industry, it's really getting down to just the weight gain and the feed efficiency that they're getting out of that. Explain the dynamics of that.
Yeah, so that number is interesting because I've spent the last 15 years of my career with Central running around the country talking about over $1 billion in losses. Well, the great thing about when cattle prices go up and value of cattle go up, also the negative impact of these type external parasites also goes up. So yeah, we've had to up that number to over $2 billion, probably closer to $3 billion as these cattle prices continue to rise and what those horn flies are costing them. And overall, what we're talking about, a lot of people are mainly focused on weight gain. So being able, if you're a mama cow, keep weight on. If you're trying to put weight on an animal, trying to put weight on those calves, we see a difference of 20 pounds in weaning weight on average, weaning weight gains on herds that are using a fly control program. If someone was putting stockers on it, if you're putting a number on stockers, it's about 30 pounds on average. So yeah, there's a lot of negative impact when it comes to weight gain. And that'd be probably the first place that most people look at.
Mm-hmm. You'd mentioned that we can count on a fly season. And with that mindset, it gets back to then, I know parts of the country from north to south, it could vary a little bit, but timing, when we look at, okay, if we know we got to address this hornfly issue that's going to be present in our cattle, seeing them is not the necessarily time. There's kind of a time ahead of that that's really the more optimal time.
Yeah, you're right. Timing is really important. And like you said, we always have a fly season. Now that fly season may vary by 30 days any given year, whether it starts sooner or later. We've had an earlier fly season where I live here in Missouri this year, just based on temperatures being warmer. Anytime you get temperatures over 60, 65, the flies emerge. And so we want to make sure that we're thinking about a fly control program and implementing it before we really see those populations bloom, because one fly can turn into thousands in a matter of weeks if we allow them to. So if we use a product like a feed through, we want to make sure we're getting that out there in front of those animals where they're consuming it and start treating that manure before those fly populations can get out of control. Because once they have an adult population, it's harder to bring them back under control. That's when you're going to have to start using some topicals and some things to kill those adult flies. But if we're using a feed through like Alticid or Clarifly, we want to make sure that we're stopping those flies early on in that process. So we have what we call a 30-30 program. If you're in an area where you don't use fly control year round, the idea is start 30 days before your last frost in the spring, and then feed it all summer until 30 days past your first frost in the fall. And so that'll vary for most folks, but for majority of the country, that would be from roughly April 1st-ish till about Thanksgiving or Halloween time, just depending on where you're at. Now, where I live here in Missouri, and as you get farther south, you start doing the math on that and the amount of days and months that you have where you maybe don't need to feed fly control or do fly control. A lot of people are using it year round if they're using a feed through fly control for that reason.
Yeah. So I'm going to hit you with a couple questions that I think as a rancher, I'm thinking through as a feed through. How do I make sure my animals are consuming this?
Yeah, consumption is the number one thing. I mean, we've got to get the drug to the bug. So consistent intake, really, really important. Whatever supplementation somebody's using, whether it's a lick tub or a loose mineral or a liquid feed, if they're feeding it through any of those various, or even just some type of TMR or ration that they're feeding to some cattle, it's got to be fed through that animal. That's the name of the game, and we need to do it as consistently as possible to make sure we get as many manure pats treated as possible.
Mm-hmm. So the other thing I think about is, okay, I'm doing it, but what about my neighbor? He's not, or she's not. Am I getting any control?
Yeah, number one question I get no matter where I'm at in the country. And it makes sense, right? If you think about flies, a fly doesn't see a fence line or a pasture line. It doesn't know that it can't fly somewhere or shouldn't. And when we think about like your just standard, let's say house fly or even a face fly that's similar to a house fly, those flies can fly 4 to 8 miles in any given day. So they can migrate. So that question's valid for people. But when it comes to that horn fly, again, the fly that's costing that producer the most money, the one that's being the most detrimental to their cattle, that fly characteristically, the way it was made, is just not meant to fly far. It's a very host specific fly. And there's three main reasons for that, why that is. Number one, it eats all the time. It takes 20 to 30, as high as 40 blood meals a day. So it's got to eat that often. It's going to stay at the dinner table. That's on the back, sides, and bellies of that cow. Secondly, it does all of its breeding on that animal, so it doesn't have any reason to leave to go breed. It does it right there on that animal. Thirdly, the only place that hornfly can lay eggs is in fresh cattle manure. And when I say fresh, I mean less than 10 to 15 minutes old. So we've got a captive audience with that hornfly. It can only lay eggs in that manure that's dropped by that animal it's on. It's got to do all its breeding and eating there. It's just very host specific. And I always ask a producer that doesn't believe me on that, go watch your cows walk across the pasture. Maybe they bump into each other. Maybe they don't even do that. Maybe they're just swinging their tail, slinging their head back, trying to get the flies off their back. Where do those horn flies go? They go off and right back on that animal. They're like a blanket. They are very host specific. So it's very unlikely for them to jump a fence or a herd because they have everything they need right there on that one animal. So people don't have to worry about what their neighbors are doing when it comes to hornfly control. They can still achieve good hornfly control. Now, when it comes to face flies, if they're dealing with those, then yes, that's something you have to be concerned about. You may need to use a topical for that situation, but the hornfly itself is a very host-specific fly.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back real briefly, and just as you had mentioned earlier about the timing is important. I think more than in that mindset of thinking about timing is really an overall comprehensive plan. And I know with Central Life Sciences, as we're talking about, Alticid IGR and a feed-through option that's here, there is more. You talked a little bit about other products that you guys have, but really developing a comprehensive plan with what you guys have available is something that could be very helpful.
Yeah, no doubt. We have what we call an integrated pest management program that we really promote. We know that there's no real silver bullet for everybody out there. Every situation's different. Every area of the country is different. Every season, while I say we have fly season every year, there'll be some seasons that you just have more flies than others, or more face flies than others, or whatever the situation is. So depending on what you're dealing with that given year, you may have a reason to go hit them with a spray or a pour-on, or put that back rubber or oiler out there, or dust bag. Or if you got flies up around the barns and house, using a scatter bait or a bait spray or a trap, that we've got a product for your issue. Just make sure you find us, reach out to your local feed rep that you work with. We work with all the major feed companies. We'd love to help you with that problem and come up with a solution for you.
You bet. And I think one of the things you said, have a plan. That's probably as key as anything, isn't it?
Yeah. If you don't have a plan, you're just going to be throwing a lot of money at the wall, hoping something sticks. So come up with a plan on it every single year. Like I said, this is something that if you get your mineral shipped to you in the spring, make sure it has fly control in it every single year. It should just be an automatic option for you. If there's a certain time of the year that you need to hit them with a spray because the face flies get bad, make sure you have a plan for that as well. Switch up those technologies. Don't use the same active every year so you don't build resistance to them. So put a plan together, and that's the best way to attack it. We'd love to help anyone put that plan together to help them be successful.
You bet. Well, Brian, good conversation here. A lot of ways that folks can get a hold of fly control products with that Alticid in it. A lot of different products in our market today, and it's something that really has revolutionized fly control over the years. Appreciate you being here today on the program.
Justin, I really appreciate the time.
You bet. And again, that was Brian Hupp with Central Life Sciences. The website, again, if you want more information, alticidIGR.com. Also, he had mentioned centralflycontrol.com. Now, that website will take you to the Clarify product, and he said they've had a lot of success and a lot of interest in that for pasture fly control. We'll be back with weather after this.
Fascinated by our wild weather? Now you can learn, appreciate, and understand the weather in your own backyard with the new Tropo Rain Gauge. Having achieved the highest rating of any product reviewed by the WeatherStationExperts.com, the Tropo boasts rugged durability, impeccable accuracy, and precision to the 100th of an inch. Visit MeasureRain.com to order a Tropo today and use code RAINDAY. That's RAINDAY for free shipping and 10% off. Go to MeasureRain.com.
Today's Long Range Weather brought to you by Long Range Epidemectin with 150 days of parasite protection in just one single dose. Help your herd out, grazing and gaining weight without extra parasite pressure. To find out more, their website is longrangedewormer.com. And joining us now with a look at our long range weather is meteorologist Don Day. And Don, as you and I were joking a little bit before we started here today, we're a lot of question in the future forecast that we're looking at because of what's going on up at in the polar vortex. We just know at some point something's going to happen.
Yeah, no, actually, there's a lot happening, and that there lies in the uncertainty in the forecast here when we look out into the next 7 to 10 days and out to a couple of weeks. First of all, you mentioned the polar vortex. Usually by the middle of April, it's gone. The polar vortex has been, as we know, extremely active all winter, coming and going and really affecting things. And it is a lot stronger than it normally is this time of year. And that's kind of altering the way the jet stream patterns worked across the northern hemisphere. But what we're going to see over the next week is that it's finally going to evaporate and dissipate. That's going to kind of cause the jet stream to shift. The other thing that's going on is that the Southern Oscillation Index has gone into a negative phase pretty strongly. That is the signs that El Nino is going to get going. It's not there yet. It's not, we can't technically say we're in an El Nino, but that negative index means that the Pacific is changing towards the anticipated El Nino forming here in the coming months. You take that, the eraser of the polar vortex, those are big scale, large scale changes in the atmosphere, which will change weather patterns across the globe and across the lower 48 states. So current patterns we've been in are likely going to be altered and into something different.
So when the timing on this would be, I guess, where everybody and where I question and I want to know, with those two events taking place simultaneously, we're kind of coming together in those, what are we going to see and when?
Well, if we were to look at the calendar, it's going to be happening between the 20th and the 30th of April, then heading on into early May. And what we're going to see is a shift of where the precipitation patterns have been most frequent. If you look at the rain that's fallen over the last 3 weeks from East Texas through East Oklahoma and Kansas into the Great Lakes region and the northwest areas of the Corn Belt, they've just been getting rained on 3 weeks in a row, while we have a worsening drought in the southeastern United States and the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, into eastern areas of Arkansas, and drought conditions continuing in the Central High Plains and Rockies. But those areas are, I'm not saying they won't go to the opposite, but where the concentration of precipitation has been is going to shift. The question is, where will they shift to? So this could mean good news for the drought areas because the shifting weather pattern may displace what we're currently in now. Mm-hmm. So the pattern changes that are coming over the next 7 to 10 days have been somewhat projected. And now that we're seeing at least that chance that they're going to develop does lead to at least a little bit of hope that some of the dry areas, especially in the central and western United States, can get some help.
All right. Well, we will cross our fingers and cross everything else we can and hope for some moisture. Appreciate the update here today.
Sure thing.
And again, that was meteorologist Don Day with a look at our long-range weather. You can tune in each and every morning to his daily video podcast. Find the link at his website at dayweather.com. Coming up on next week's edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show will be my conversation with Steve Rines. He is the president and CEO of the Noble Research Institute. We're going to learn a little bit more about that, as well as something that really intrigued me was talking about some of their educational courses that they have to expand the education, professional development for you and I as ranchers. So stick around for next week's edition of the program. Well, the Working Ranch Radio Show is a production of Working Ranch Magazine, branded #1 by America's Ranchers. If you'd like to get a hold of me, it's simple. You can send me an email at justin.workingranch@gmail.com. Thanks for joining us. I'm Justin Mills, and until next time, keep your chin down and your mind in the middle. So long.